You're listening to The Voluntary Life, where you can hear ideas for finding freedom in an unfree world. Visit thevoluntarylife.com to connect with the show and hear all past episodes. Here's your host, Jake.
Hi, it's Jake here. Welcome to The Voluntary Life. In this episode, I'd like to talk about what I think is one of the really important psychological challenges of entrepreneurship. At least it has been one of the really important challenges for me. And that is just how embarrassing it is to become an entrepreneur, particularly in the early stages of any venture. Becoming an entrepreneur opens you up to embarrassment, and a lot of it. And although that might not sound important compared to some of the other challenges that you face, like funding your venture and so forth, I think this psychological challenge is actually far more important than a lot of people realize. So I want to talk about it because I hope that by telling you my experience, it will help you also be conscious of the psychological challenge that you face in becoming an entrepreneur. And this really applies in particular to the early stages in any entrepreneurial venture. So first off, I just want to read out the definition of embarrassment that comes from Wikipedia. Embarrassment is an emotional state of intense discomfort with oneself, experienced upon having a socially unacceptable act or condition witnessed by or revealed to others. Usually some amount of loss of honor or dignity is involved, but how much and the type depends on the embarrassing situation. It's similar to shame, except that shame may be experienced for an act known only to oneself. Also, embarrassment usually carries the connotation of being caused by an act that's merely socially unacceptable rather than morally wrong. I think that's a really useful definition. And in particular, it highlights what it is that I'm talking about, which is the experience of doing something that other people find socially unacceptable or other people disapprove of. So here's the funny thing about becoming an entrepreneur. It involves an odd combination of mindsets. Firstly, it's always a critical mindset, becoming an entrepreneur, because you're looking at what exists now and you're trying to build something new, something better, a product that allows people to do things in a better way or provide more value. So there's a critical mindset involved where you're criticizing the world by creating something new. But at the same time, becoming an entrepreneur involves a huge amount of empathy. So you're constantly empathizing with your customers, trying to understand how they think and feel, how they're experiencing your product, what it is that they're making of it, so that you can improve your product and provide a better product or service to them. And it's this empathy in particular, I think, that leads to embarrassment, because you're aware of what other people think about what you're doing. And you need to be, because you need to understand whether or not people are finding your product useful and valuable and how you can make it better. So becoming an entrepreneur opens you up to a huge amount of feedback from others about what it is that you're doing. And that is a vulnerable position to be in, especially in the early stages of entrepreneurship, because the key thing about the early stages of entrepreneurship is you have no clue what you're doing. And this has been my experience in the venture that I founded and grew and sold. And it's also my experience now in the new route that I've taken in writing books. So when you combine that attitude of empathy towards how other people are experiencing your product with the trial and error of the early stages of any business, it's really embarrassing, because the fact is you make loads of mistakes. So I experienced this when I first started the consultancy business that I grew and sold. In the first year, I had no clue what I was doing. I made hardly any sales in the first year. I put out loads of proposals to clients that were clearly not what they needed because they didn't buy. Not just in selling, but in every aspect of the business. That first year was pretty much a continuous cycle of deciding to do something and then finding out that it didn't work. I'm going to have to go back and start again. And I made a ton of embarrassing, easily avoidable mistakes too. I was so overwhelmed trying to learn how to get organized that I made basic mistakes like not being in the office when a client turned up for a meeting. That was embarrassing. I think the most embarrassing experiences for me during the period of my consultancy business was when I found out that we had made errors in reports that we'd done. which people had paid good money for. And this happened a number of times throughout the course of my business. And each time I would have to go and fess up to the client and explain that the report was incorrect and that we needed to update it and give them another version. I found that really embarrassing. And then there were mistakes like spending loads of money on stuff that I just didn't need to spend money on. I've talked about this quite a lot in my book, Becoming an Entrepreneur. And, one of the reasons that I wrote the book was to try and explain the mistakes that I made so that I hope that, they're helpful for you in seeing what I learned from my own mistakes. I hope you can avoid some of those mistakes. So in the book, I talk about how I borrowed way more money than I really needed to, and I had to learn by experience to try and fund the growth of the business through selling, and so many other mistakes too. So you can read all about those mistakes in my book. And now that I'm doing something new, writing books, I'm making a whole new load of mistakes because, again, I'm just starting out and I'm learning the process of being a writer. I'm learning about the process of writing, the process of publishing, and the process of marketing books. And however good you are, there's always a certain amount of trial and error involved in becoming an entrepreneur. And the thing is that making mistakes, making errors is looked down on. And this is something that's conditioned from super early on. We all experienced it in school. Most of us experienced it in our families, that it's better to be mediocre and not make any embarrassing mistakes than it is to make huge mistakes and learn from them. So this is what happens to me, and maybe this happens to you too. When I make mistakes, my empathy kicks in and I imagine how other people are going to perceive that, and I think about what they're going to think of me, and I feel embarrassment, and I can't control that feeling because it's associated with my own history, my own childhood, my school experiences, and all of the previous experiences that I've had that give rise to those feelings. And doing things like starting a new business is something that immediately confronts you with those feelings, which is a challenge because it's not comfortable. Now, I can't control the way that I feel, but I can choose how to respond to those feelings. And I'm going to come back to that at the end. The second aspect of why it's embarrassing is, as an entrepreneur, you become aware of how incompetent you are when you're starting a business. So there's a model of this that's called the stages of learning, or stages of competence, I think. I'll put a link in the show notes. The idea is that in any process of learning, you start off being unconsciously incompetent. You don't know how little you know about something. And this is typically associated with sort of a false confidence, that people think like that I would be great at doing that before they get into something. And then when they actually start doing something and learning a new skill, they realize, whoa, I don't know anything about this and I'm useless at it. And that is a really important growing stage in learning any skill. You step out of the comfort zone of thinking that if you did that, you'd probably be great at it. You actually step into learning a new skill, and as you start learning, you realize just how much there is to learn and just how little you know. And most importantly, just how little you're able to do. You become conscious of how incompetent you are. And that is also very embarrassing. At least it is for me, and I think it is for most people. It's a very uncomfortable state to be in. It puts you outside your comfort zone, and you have to sit with the discomfort of knowing that you're trying to do something that you're really bad at. I totally experienced this with my first business when I started a consultancy. I jumped in very excited about starting my own business and then realized just how little I knew, how I couldn't even read accounts. I didn't know anything about selling. I didn't really know about marketing. I suddenly realized all of these skills that were vital that I just didn't know anything about. And I'm right back at square one by changing what it is that I do. And now I'm writing books. I'm acutely aware of how much I still have to learn and how little competence I currently have when it comes to writing good books, about publishing books, about marketing books. And it's embarrassing because socially, again, through school and through our families, we are taught to respect competence and to ridicule incompetence. Isn't that the basic experience of school? I mean, that was certainly the experience of school for me. In my experience was I was considered to be kind of a nerd at school, and I, like many people, I experienced bullying, and also I was no good at team sports. I hated physical education, as they called it, and any team sports where I wanted to learn to play and I wasn't as good as other kids was a situation where my initial incompetence would just be totally ridiculed. And so would any other kid who tried to do that who was in a similar position. I mean, we all carry that lesson deep inside us. And consequently, we're aware of the risk of putting yourself out there in a vulnerable way where you're trying to learn something and you're not good at it yet. Now, the funny thing is that the key thing about conscious incompetence is that it's a vital stage to go through, because the next stage after that is that you do become competent. You can't get good at anything unless you recognize to yourself what you're not good at yet. And so you've got to go through that discomfort in order to actually make it. But the going through the conscious incompetence stage is really embarrassing. You know, it's the same if you go and live in another country and you want to learn the language. There's a really embarrassing stage where you're trying to communicate and you just can't say what you want to say, but you have to go through that embarrassment in order to actually get good. You have to keep trying to communicate in order to really learn the language. So another aspect of why this experience is embarrassing, especially in the first stages of entrepreneurship, is that as an entrepreneur, all of these mistakes that you make and all of the incompetence that you experience, it's all on your shoulders. There's nobody else to blame. Because when you're an employee, you're always working within the context of somebody else's business. Whatever crazy stuff you're doing, there's always an excuse that basically somebody else told you to do it. Whereas if you're an entrepreneur, all your wacky ideas are your own. And, you know, you may have advisors and you may have people who've suggested stuff to you, but ultimately it's your decision to try and create this product or market it in this way or put yourself out there as an entrepreneur as you are doing so. And so that means that you take the blame, basically. And the embarrassment for your mistakes goes on your own shoulders. I don't have any great suggestions about how to not feel embarrassed, because I feel embarrassed when I realize how incompetent I am at learning new skills. I did, as I said, in my first business, and I do now when I realize how little I know about writing books and publishing books and marketing books. But I do think it's really important to be conscious of it, because here's the thing. Entrepreneurship is embarrassing, and that's okay. It's not going to kill you. It's going to make you feel a bit uncomfortable sometimes. The thing about feelings is that we do have the opportunity to decide what to do with them. You experience feelings, but you can decide what your response is going to be, what they mean to you. And you can also be conscious of where they come from and how they're related to your history. Feelings like embarrassment come from important lessons that we learned for survival as kids. But that doesn't mean that those lessons are still applicable as adults. And the funny thing about it is, at least in my experience, the more conscious you are of experiencing these feelings, the less significant they are, the more that you're able to handle it and even laugh about it and see the funny side of some of the embarrassing situations that come up when becoming an entrepreneur. The difficulty comes, I think, if you're not conscious of these feelings, or if you're not admitting them to yourself or not experiencing them consciously. I really believe that a lot of the reason that people don't become entrepreneurs is because at some unconscious level, they get how embarrassing it's going to be. Even though they're not thinking about it consciously, they know how embarrassing it's going to be. Making lots of mistakes and starting something new that you're not good at, and they don't want to go through that stage of embarrassment. So even though they may say it's for other reasons, I think this is actually one of the reasons why people don't want to leave a secure job. Of course, there are other risks, there are financial risks and so forth. But this risk of social disapproval, of people looking down on what you're doing or thinking that, you've made silly mistakes and so forth, I think is something that really holds people back. And I can totally understand it, because before I sold my business and changed my career, so to speak, and went into what I'm doing now, podcasting and writing books, I was in a position where I'd worked for a long time to build up a reputation, to be an expert in a particular field. And that was a really nice comfort zone in many ways. People trusted things that I said. I had a lot of past work that I could point to that showed my experience and showed sort of what I was capable of delivering. And now I'm kind of back at square one again, because I've left that career behind and I'm starting something new. And that's true for everyone who starts their own business. Even if they're using the skills that they had from their previous job, there's always the business aspect of it that's new. You're outside your comfort zone, and that opens you up to a lot of embarrassing mistakes. So I wanted to just put this podcast out there to say, I feel it too, and I consider it to be part of the process. And there's a quote that I really like by Andre Gide, which is, "One doesn't discover new lands without consenting to lose sight of the shore for a very long time." I hope that's helpful. If you found it useful, I really recommend checking out my book, Becoming an Entrepreneur, How to Find Freedom and Fulfillment as a Business Owner. I talk about all my mistakes in that book, and I hope that will also be something that you will find encouraging as you go through the embarrassment of becoming an entrepreneur. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you for listening to The Voluntary Life. If you have feedback about the show, please email jake@thevoluntarylife.com. If you enjoyed this program, please share the podcast with your friends or click the donate button on thevoluntarylife.com.